But still, despite all this, God himself wants to be our king individually, and he wants to make us the true temple of God, as I'm explaining in here. But at the end of the day, having a man as our head can eventually become a hindrance for God working directly with us, though. Again, whether that man is a tyrant, suppressing us down under his thumb, or whether that man is a sweet-natured father figure who loves us dearly, we still need, if at all possible, to grow up, to become adults ourselves, and to allow God to be our head instead of mere man. And just because God ordains a leadership ministry to be over a group of people, God did not mean for us to continue to have flesh as our head instead of Jesus. For once again, we need to grow up if it's at all possible for us to do, though there will always be some who cannot. But anyways, let's continue our observations in Samuel, where we had left off, and that people scream for God to give them a fleshly king over them instead of God himself being their king. For when the realization of God's displeasure of people wanting a fleshly head over them instead of him finally hits them, then 1 Samuel 8:18. You shall cry out in that day because of your king which you shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. I got another explanatory note real quick. And you shall cry out in that day because of your king which you shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Surely, no person in their right mind either wants to be duped by another person or that they really want to become subject to a dictator. Even though in many situations in life, some people find themselves under an evil regime, whether under a church government or even a country's government, there really could be no pleasure in the participation of such a venture unless they are evil in nature themselves, of course, or that they're a bit slow in their thinking and understanding, or they just simply haven't grown up just yet. On the other hand, if a person does happen to find themselves in a bad way, they may not know how to get out of it without either harming themselves or harming a loved one. Yeah, there's situations like that. They may simply not know how to bow out for fear of displeasing God, since they would view that church's headship, even if evil, as godly ordained, which I've briefly explained. I feel that it was God's ordination anyway, but that the situation needs to be understood for what it really is, as I'm going to continue to explain, and that God may either move a person out of it when he's ready for them to leave, or that they need to remain in it to help other innocent people who are stuck in there themselves. Of course, and on the opposite side of that thought, there are many good churches out here, yes there are, who actually have a loving and caring ministry behind their helm. But at the same time, it needs to be pointed out that just because there are good churches abroad, that we still need to see the church for what it truly is, both good and bad churches. That is for what God had intended for it to be for his people, of how he wishes for us to see it ourselves. In my dictation of 1 Samuel chapter 8, I may have opened a can of worms to some people with my comparison of an earthen king with a modern-day fleshly-minded pastor, a dictator that is. For goodly pastors are not comparable with such kings, even though goodly pastors can become a king to other people if those people refuse to grow up and remain children in their understanding because of either laziness and their refusal of changing into a mature child of God. Look, we all as Christians have a place in the church world, okay? We all have a place, whether in an actual building or in a home meeting, whatever. And everybody is on different levels of understanding and positions. Not only, but unlike these baby and teenage Christians, that is, those who are still novices and who still need some milk, 1 Corinthians 3:2, Hebrews 5:12 through 13, who still need leadership and guidance, mature Christians, of whom God has ordained as ministers, can actually branch out to minister in other churches, start a new church themselves, or to simply witness to people on the streets, whatever they're ordained to do. But with such a statement, I have to clarify that I am only speaking of their leadership positions when I say such things as that. That is, of whom Paul mentions in his letters, and of whom we call in our modern way fivefold ministry: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, as they're so called in Ephesians 4:11. On the other hand, and in a different perspective, there can also be mature Christians within a single church who do not leave an assembly as much as these others may do, but are workers within a single church and who are under its ministry therein. We have to understand their role also. Thus far, I've only hit upon the leadership ministry and the babies and the teenagers that they help and teach. But, and as I will also get into better detail later on in this book, and as I've just suggested, this fivefold ministry is not the only ministry of God. These others are the helps and the governments. They don't specifically leave the church, as do the 5 leadership positions at various times, to go out and start new churches or to travel around from church to church or from house meeting to house meeting. That is, assuming that they are even led away from their current church to do so, to do such things by the hand of God. However, in my opinion, these helps and governments are just as important as the 5 main offices, being just as mature. But God has granted the fivefold ministry the right to make deeper and final decisions of what goes on in his kingdom and in the church world. Therefore, I see the role of these helps and governments as to be in God's ministry who do stay within a single church building, helping the fivefold ministers to train and teach these babies and teenagers who come in off from the streets, who are just beginning their journey, for this should be the function of the modern church world. We all have jobs to do within it in one way or another. Nobody can escape being a part of the church world if they are a true child of God, which thought, by the way, deserves more explanations. And I'm going to do that slowly herein. Therefore, and unlike the 5 offices of church leadership, the helps and the governments are under their ministry and not equal to them as to being able to make the final decision on matters. But, and as I'm also going to explain in here, they are equal to them in being a child of God and are still leaders, because God is not a respecter of persons. Even though there are offices of hierarchy within the church, we'll have to understand what all of that means also, of which views, as one will say, may not be the same herein as most Christians view it. For many people believe that such ministerial offices, as the 5 are, the main 5, give such men the right to become people's lords and masters, a thought that I'm going to attempt to destroy in this book. Certainly, as I keep promising to do, we're going to get into all such things as we plod along.